Thank you. Thank you very much, Jens, for the kind invitation to be here. My presentation will follow, I think, very nicely from what has just been said. I was asked to take on a question. Is debt a symptom or a cause of risks to financial stability? Now, the short answer to the question, I don't have the pointer, I'm afraid. I need the, very good, thank you. Sorry about that. So the short answer to the question is that debt is generally both a symptom and a cause of financial crisis. It is a cause because, indeed, financial crises are typically due to excessive debt, although usually private, but sometimes also excessive public debt. It's also a symptom because, indeed, financial crisis, as we know, and I will show, results in much high increase of public debt and even possibly in sovereign debt crisis or even sovereign defaults. Now, what I will do in this presentation are three things. First, I will examine recent trends in financial and debt crisis. Second, I will look at linkages between financial and debt crisis. And then I will come to policy implications. So let me first start with 3 slides about recent trends. And what I will want to do throughout this presentation is talk about the advanced economies, but also a bit the advanced economies in contrast with the emerging and the developing countries. So the first slide simply says that in the advanced economies, financial crises are back. No, we know that they are back, but I wanted to show you some long-term data, and this comes from a 2014 study by Jorda, Schuleric, and Taylor, who look at financial crisis in 18 advanced countries for the period from 1870 to 2011. Now, what you see there are essentially 2 or 3 periods. There's first the period until the Second World War. From 1870 to the Second World War, to the start of the Second World War, there is on average, in those 17 advanced economies, 10 crises per decade, 1 per year, in a sense. And then you have the Second World War and the years immediately after where there are no crises. And crises then start again a little bit in the 70s, in the 80s, even in the 90s. But it's true that if you look at this entire period from the beginning of World War II until the end of the 20th century, you have on average about 2 crises per decade. Okay, very, very few crises. And then we have the recent episode, 2007, 2008, where you had, again, many crises. So in a sense, we are back to where we had been before, and we thought we had moved away from. That's the first issue. The second striking element, looking at the facts, is comparing the advanced economies with the emerging and developing countries. And I have here, those are data that come from the IMF, from the famous Leuven and Valencia database. I'm looking here at banking crisis worldwide for the period from 1970 to 2012. By decades, I have again in blue the advanced economies. I have now in red the emerging economies, and in green the developing economies. No, we know that in the 80s, in the 90s, I don't have to tell that to Stan Fisher, we had many, many crises in the emerging and in the developing countries. But what is special about the recent period is that there were more crises, in fact, in the advanced economies than in developing and emerging countries combined. There were very few banking crises recently, both in the emerging, there had been so many, and in developing countries. So not only crises are back in the advanced economies, but they are even more important now than they are in the emerging and developing countries. And the third point I want to make in those trends is to look at debt defaults. Now, debt default is something that is unusual in the advanced economies, or was unusual until very recently. Since 1970, there were 66 sovereign defaults in emerging and developing countries. There was only one in the advanced economy, Greece, in 2012. But what is even more striking, perhaps, is that in the emerging countries, where there had been so many crises, there's not been a single one, a single default, since the last one took place in Argentina in 2001. So this is really a new world looking at the advanced and the developing countries. Now, let me look at linkages between banking and sovereign debt crisis. And what I will do in the presentation is focus on three issues. First, the linkages between debt problems and financial crisis. Two, the linkages from financial crisis to sovereign debt crisis and possibly default. And three, the bank sovereign feedback loops from sovereign to bank and back. And obviously look at the policy issues to mitigate this. Now, the first issue, from debt to financial crisis. Who is the culprit? Is it private or is it public debt in the advanced economy that is the cause, the main cause of financial crisis? And then again, I go back to the study by Jorda, Schularic, and Taylor that look at this long period from 1870 to 2011. And what they find is that typically financial crises in the advanced economies are caused by private credit booms rather than by public debt problems, but there are some exceptions. And again, Greece obviously comes to mind. Now, if you look at their econometrics, and I'm not going to look in detail over the econometrics, what is clear is that when you try to explain the occurrence of financial crisis based on private debt and by public debt, you get most of the explanation from changes, from private credit booms. Adding sort of public debt here in the story, trying to explain financial crisis, doesn't add much. Again, doesn't mean that there are not some outliers, but this is sort of the typical pattern for the advanced economies. Now, however, it doesn't mean that the level of public debt at the start of the financial crisis does not have an impact on financial recessions, on what follows financial crisis. We know that financial crises are followed by financial recessions, and those recessions can be rather long. And we see that both the depth and the length of financial recession is very much linked to the level of public debt at the start of the crisis. And this is what the chart shows here. When the level of debt is very high, those recessions are much longer and much deeper. When the level of public debt at the start of the crisis is not very, very high, then those financial crises are not very different from normal recession. So public debt may not play a big role as the detonator to the financial crisis, but once the financial crisis starts, then what is the level of public debt matters quite a lot for the recession and for the prolongation. And let me come, therefore, to the second issue, from financial crisis to sovereign debt crisis and problems. And let's separate two channels, the channels of transmission from financial crisis to financial stress, and then from financial stress to sovereign debt crisis. It's clear that once you get a financial crisis, there will be fiscal stress in the economy. And it will come from two sources. First, government support to the financial sector, especially in the advanced economies, in the form of guarantees, in the form of bailouts. It costs to the public finances. But there is also obviously the fact that government plays an important role in the real economy stabilization policy. And the recession generates fiscal stress. Now, the other issue is you have fiscal stress, and from fiscal stress you can get into really difficulty with sovereign debt problems. And that depends, as I will show, first on fiscal space. How much fiscal space do you have? It is, in a sense, how big is your level of public debt at the start of the financial crisis. But it depends also on the type of debt, whether you have domestic or foreign currency debt. Now, let's look at the impact of systemic banking crisis on public debt. And again, I'm using the data from the IMF that I discussed before, from Leuven and Valencia. So looking at all the crises, in all banking crises in the advanced economies, in the emerging economies, and in the developing countries from 1970 to 2012. And I'm using their definition of looking at the impact of debt, of financial crisis on debt. So from T-1, if T is the year of the financial crisis, is the increase in debt from T-1, the year before the financial crisis, until T plus 3 years after the financial crisis. What you see here in this table, in terms of the public debt increase, is that, and those are median numbers, if you look at the advanced economies, the median for the advanced economies is 25 points of GDP of debt increase. In the developing and in the emerging countries, it's only about 10. It's much smaller. Now, presumably, there are two reasons for this difference between the advanced economies and the developing and the emerging countries. First is that in advanced economies, the banking sector is bigger. And second, in the advanced economies, the safety net, the government safety net, the role that public finances plays in financial crisis is much bigger. Now, what I've done is look at the data from Leuven and Valencia, look at all of the crises, all the banking crises for the period from 1970 to 2012 in the advanced economies, and rank them by the increase of public debt. And those are the top 10 increases. I've put in yellow the G7 countries, Japan, UK, and the US, that are the only three among the top 10. And I've also indicated the date of the financial crisis. You see, most of those crises, obviously 2008, 2007. There is the crisis, obviously, of Japan, 1997. There is Finland and Sweden, 1991. And you see that among those top 10, the increase in public debt in this T-1 until T plus 3, into this 5-year period, goes from 75% points of GDP for Ireland and Iceland to about 30 for Sweden and the United States. So those are very, very large. Numbers. Now I'm going to skip this slide where I'm looking, and I mean Jens discussed that, I think, and very rightly, that we shouldn't just look at public debt. We need to look also at what's happening in private debt. But I think the one element that I want to draw your attention from this chart, and from this table that comes from McKinsey Global Institute, is that if you look at some of the G7 countries, the 5 G7 countries that were hit by the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, that is excluding Japan and Canada, there are different behaviors in terms of the increase of public debt and the deleveraging of private debt. Okay, if those crises, they were caused essentially by public debt, then one would want and one would think that there is deleveraging of the private sector. And that's the reason why some of the increase of the public debt takes place. So to the extent that, in a sense, the public debt increases, but on the other hand, it sort of balances the deleveraging from the private sector, one should be somewhat reassured that one is, in a sense, using well this increase of the public debt in order to prevent recession to deepen in the deleveraging process. And you see that this is happening in some countries. This is not happening in others, and I will not discuss the detail. Now, one of the questions that arises that I mentioned already is the issue of fiscal space. So there is fiscal stress that comes from a financial crisis, but how much fiscal space is there? Now, fiscal space is a difficult notion to discuss. It's about sort of fiscal limits. Where's the fiscal limit? Now, it's hard to estimate, and there are some brave people who have tried to estimate fiscal limits. There is interesting work by Libre and by his co-authors. There's also work by the IMF, by Atish Ghosh and some of his co-authors, who estimate probabilities of having fiscal space in 2015, given some shock. And I'm giving you those numbers here in this table for the G7 economies and for some non-G7 advanced economies. And what you see in the first column is the probability of having some fiscal space. Okay, and you see there, this probability runs from 99.9 for Sweden of having some fiscal space to Japan, which is ranked here as having basically no fiscal space at all. And then what the second column does is say, well, what is the probability that you have fiscal space if you are hit by an increase in public debt of 50 points of GDP? So a big hit, but again, look at what has happened recently. It's not unrealistic kind of numbers. And again, you see Sweden has 99.9% probability to be able to deal with that, Germany 92.3, Canada 92.1, France, etc. Then one goes down the list, and again, you get to countries that basically do not have any fiscal space, either fiscal space at all or to deal with a shock. I've put here 2 of the G7 economies, Italy and Japan, and I've put 2 of the advanced economies that are non-G7, Portugal and Greece. So indeed, this is a real issue. And I want to emphasize that there's a big contrast now between public debt levels in the G7 economies and in the emerging and developing countries. And those are numbers from the IMF once again. What you see is that since 2007, so if you look at the period from 2007 to 2014, public debt in the aggregate of G7 economies has increased by 48.4 points of GDP in the advanced economies. In the emerging countries, only by 2.5. What is even more striking is that the difference in public debt levels between advanced economies, the G7 economies, and the developing and emerging countries now is 80 points of GDP. So before the crisis, in the period from 2000 to 2007, there had already been an increase in the gap between the advanced, that had already a little bit more debt levels than in the developing countries, and that was due to the fast growth, a much faster growth in the developing and emerging countries. Since the crisis, the gap has much increased, there not so much because of the growth gap between the 2 groups of countries, but because of the crisis that hit, as I indicated before, only the advanced economies and what has happened as a result of that. Now, it doesn't mean that we should not be worried about what may happen in some of the emerging economies, and I think China is certainly a point in case. And I've indicated here in this table, again, from the McKinsey Global Institute data, that China, if you look at the aggregate level of debt, so both private and public, and those are the numbers there in the white column, in the sort of on the left, you see that the level of debt in China is roughly the same as in the US. The US is 233% of GDP. In China is now 217. But what has happened in China recently is a huge increase on the private debt sector, mostly corporate, but also household. So corporate debt from 2007 to 2014 in China has increased by 52 points of GDP, and household debt by 18%. So not so much public debt, there is really sort of the private debt, and one may ask oneself indeed whether a financial crisis is brewing there with this increase in the private debt. Sorry. Now, coming to issue number 3, the bank sovereign feedback loop. Jens talked quite a bit about this, and this is indeed in the recent crisis, and in particular in the euro area, this was one of the main features of the crisis, and one of the most worrisome features that we saw. That not only there'd been a financial crisis, and from the financial crisis we got into a sovereign debt crisis, but then the sovereign was looping back to the financial crisis into this vicious circle that happened. Now, many people have looked at that. There's a very nice paper that I advise you to read, sort of a review of the literature, but very nicely done by the two economists at the Board of Governors, Correa and Sapir, who discuss all of those issues. And they discuss what we know, that there are different channels of transmission in a crisis, from sovereign to bank crisis. There's first a collateral channel. If sovereign risk occurs, that weighs obviously on the banks that use sovereign debt as collateral. They have less collateral, less good collateral. Obviously, that's one. The second is the rating. Once there is a downgrade of the public debt rating, that infects the entire economy, including, obviously, the banks. And third, what I already discussed, is the government support channel. Government supports the banks, but if the sovereign is in bad shape, is obviously less able to support in one way or the other the banks, and that sends obviously jitters through the banking system. Now, it is very clear, and I will discuss that in a second in more detail, is that the problem of this bank sovereign feedback loop is exacerbated by direct exposures of banks, not just indirect, but by direct exposures of banks to sovereigns, in particular to their national sovereign. Now, let me just look, before I come to policy issues, let me just look at 4 cases of sovereign bank linkages, not necessarily feedback loops, sovereign bank linkages and crisis. And I want to take 2 pairs of crises. One is Sweden 91, and compare it to, let's say, Spain 2008. And the other one is Argentina 2001 with Greece 2008, 2012. Now, why did I pair them in this manner? The first 2 cases are 2 countries where financial crises were mainly caused by private debt problems. So the typical situation that we know in the advanced economies. But there was a self-fulfilling crisis in one country, in Spain, but not in Sweden. And then the other pair is Argentina and Greece. And there we have 2 situations, one emerging economy and one advanced economy, where the financial crisis was caused mainly by public debt problems in both cases. And in both cases, there was a sovereign default. Now, I think what the difference between Sweden, which is given usually as sort of as the model of how to deal with a financial crisis. Now, there are lots of circumstances, obviously, about Sweden 91 that doesn't replicate with the advanced economies today. And one is what I showed at the beginning, is that the early 90s was not a period of many financial crises. Okay? It was a crisis in Sweden and a crisis in Finland, but the rest of the advanced economies were rather quiet. It was a good period. So there was certainly a big difference in the environment. But there's certainly another difference among all the many differences, and that is the issue certainly of own currency, of own currency debt. I think that's something that we underappreciated, perhaps, and certainly before the crisis, maybe even at the start of the crisis, is that countries in the euro area, indeed, they don't really issue debt in their own currency. Or it's not fully their own currency in the sense that certainly the sovereign doesn't have at its disposal, luckily so, the central bank to monetize the debt. So it's a totally different situation. And Jens mentioned the fact that the central bank doesn't play a role of lender of last resort in the case of the ECB. Doesn't mean, obviously, that the ECB cannot play a role and does not play a role in intervening in the sovereign debt market, but this is something different. So what we did see in Spain is that there was at some stage a self-fulfilling crisis, a self-fulfilling liquidity crisis. Spain, if you look at Spain and Sweden, as I do in this here, At the start of the crisis, and then what resulted from the crisis in terms of debt levels, Spain and Sweden were very comparable. In fact, the level of public debt a year before the financial crisis in Spain was a bit lower than it was in Sweden in 1991. So in Sweden was about 41% of GDP, in Spain was 36%. So at the start of the crisis, they were not very different. And then if you look 3 years after the crisis, the increase of the debt, again, was not very different. In Sweden, it increased by 31% of GDP. In Spain, it increased by 34%. So it's not there that you can really see the big difference between Spain and Sweden. But there was, nonetheless, for the reason I indicated second, there was for a period an issue of self-fulfilling crisis. And then came the fact that the banks in Spain were highly exposed to their sovereign. Then one got into this vicious circle. So there, I think, was clearly the difference. Argentina and Greece, in a sense, Argentina and Greece, indeed, I'm not going to go into the details, but they're in a sense very close in what happened. They are very close. Maybe a difference is that in Greece, the level of public debt just before the crisis was already very, very high, more than 100% of GDP. In Argentina, it was only 38%. But then when the crisis came, that was a public debt crisis, the debt in Argentina increases by more than 80 points of GDP. In Greece, it increased on top by 63. So you see that either the level of the debt or the increase was sort of unbearable, and they both got into a real issue of solvency and default. Now, let me come to the policy implications of all of this. Now, one does need indeed, I think there's no doubt about that, one does need indeed policies to reduce risks to financial stability. And I want to put those on the three headings: prevention, resilience of the systems, and resolution of crisis. Let me start with prevention. There I have 2 points to make. One is one of the points that was already made by Jens Weidmann, so I don't need to detail. There needs to be less incentive in the system, I think, no doubt, for risk-taking behavior by private and public debtors. And one of the issues there is certainly taxation. One of the 3 points that you made, Jens, I think this is a very important point, a difficult point politically, indeed, but I think this is a point, in terms of prevention, this is something that would help a lot. The second point that I want to make, and I want to call upon you, is to take, in the advanced economies, macroprudential policy much more seriously. Macroprudential policy is, in a sense, for us, for the advanced economies, is a new tool on the block. Some of the emerging countries have been using it quite a bit, and my friend, the governor of Turkey, often makes the point of how, not only in Turkey, but in Asian emerging countries, macroprudential policy has been used very well. And I think this is one of the reasons, among the many, why indeed the situation is much improved in the emerging countries. And I think there is certainly a lesson to take. So, we should not just pay lip service to macroprudential policy. I know it's a new field, it's difficult, but I think this is indeed something that is very, very important. Second issue is about the resilience of banks and sovereigns to shock. So, okay, one should try to prevent crises, but crises will occur. The real issue is how do you deal with crises when they do occur? And what is the ability of the system? How far is the system resilient in dealing with crisis? One has talked about, indeed, having more capital and less bank leverage, both in normal times, but also during credit booms. And again, this is a role for macroprudential policy. Indeed, as was said in the introductory speech by Jens Weidmann, there needs to be more loss absorption capacity in the system. There should be less public debt, more fiscal space. That means more public safety net functions, because crises do occur, and there's a problem of how much fiscal space is there today in the system. I think one should be worried about that. Third point, yes, I think there is, and there is more and more, use of state contingent private and public debt instruments. And then indeed this issue of less sovereign exposures by banks. That would create less danger of feedback loops. Now, I'm sure Martin Helvig will discuss this issue later, the report, the recent report that was done by the ESRB that has just been published, and which hopefully will be taken on at the international level. And I think we know that the FSB has launched a group doing that, and we heard the plea of Jens for progress in this field. I think, indeed, we do know that there is preferential treatment for sovereign exposure by banks. We know that sovereign debt is not really entirely risk-free, that sovereign defaults can occur, and that sovereign risk is an important source of systemic risk to financial institutions, and especially, as the ESRB study showed very well, if banks are exposed to their own sovereign. Now, how to reduce the exposure of financial institutions to sovereign risk? There are two avenues, and they're not mutually exclusive avenues. One is to reduce sovereign risk altogether, to have sound public finances. And that is certainly an important avenue that we should not forget. But there is also the regulatory or the prudential avenue, and that is indeed the issue of the regulation of the prudential rules that govern this preferential treatment and reduce this preferential treatment. There are different ways to do that, and the ESRB report goes into that. Obviously, one can remove the zero risk weights. One can put limits on sovereign exposure, indeed, sort of diversification rules. There are other avenues, and again, I suppose that Martin will come to that in his presentation. But I think this is indeed something very important. Finally, resolution. We have made progress in resolution, but I would say that there's still a lot of progress to be made. A lot of progress towards prompt and decisive resolution rather than forbearance and zombification. I think one of the lessons, I think that was the lesson I think probably that we all learned from Sweden, is that once you get a financial crisis and you need to resolve financial institution, time is against you. The faster you do it, the better it is. The more you wait, the more you get into difficulty and the more you get into this financial sovereign link and the loop between the two. So resolution does need to be prompt, decisive. There was a mention about bail-ins. You know, the bail-ins are in and are really bailouts out. And I think that is an issue which is difficult. I think maybe we have been telling citizens that, you know, bailouts are gone. We are in a new world of bail-ins. But I think the real issue is not sort of slogan of bail-ins, of bailouts, is the loss-absorbing capacity. Where is it? Is it with the taxpayers? That's the bailout? Or is it with the financial institutions that is, or those that are involved in that, that is with the bail-ins? So I think that means that we need really to concentrate, indeed, as is done also at the FSB level, on this TLAC and this total loss-absorbing capacity. But in general, I would say loss-absorbing capacity is the key issue in order to make progress in the resolution and move away, at least partially, from the bailouts. Conclusion. Conclusion is about prudential policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. I have focused in my presentation mainly on prudential policy, on regulatory policy, and fiscal policy, and on their respective and complementary roles to reduce risks of financial stability. I've tried to argue that both have a very important role to play to reduce risks to financial stability. I've only touched briefly on the role of monetary policy. Yet, monetary policy does impact financial balance sheets via asset prices, and therefore, financial policy does affect financial stability. And I want to agree with Marcus Brunemeyer and his co-author, Sannikov, in their very, very good paper for Jackson Hole in 2012 that I'm sure you're all familiar with, where they emphasize that the objectives of financial stability, debt sustainability, and price stability cannot be treated independently, at least fully independently, from each other by prudential, fiscal, and monetary policy authorities because of the cross effects between the three. And I think, to me, that raises a very difficult question, is how to, quote unquote, coordinate the three different authorities in order to ensure financial stability. In a sense, what we have now is that monetary authorities in all the advanced economies, certainly more and more, they are also in charge of prudential issues. So there we have the monetary authorities that have, dealing with two instruments, two objectives, although there is a relationship between those two objectives. This is the issue of, obviously, the politics, governments, fiscal policy, and how to ensure that fiscal policy also contributes or does not deter from financial stability. And I think there the issue is really how to guarantee monetary dominance. I think that's the only way, in the sense that I do see, in order to guarantee this coordination. Thank you very much.